And then the fourth point, and then we'll take some time for some questions. Having growth from current residents and current members. Think about the people God has given you, where you serve. And even if there's no population growth around your church, you can be assured that even in a heavily churched place like Nashville, Tennessee, and surroundings, that there are probably more people not in church today in your communities than any time in a long time. So there are people there. So you want to think about who's missing. Who are some people that are in the general population more so than they are in your church? When we gather for worship, who's missing? And then to realize there are some key differences right now. The makeup of regular church attenders and the makeup of the population as a whole is different in some significant ways. Regular church attenders tend to be older, less diverse, have more assets, are more educated, more likely to be married than the population as a whole. So the type of dwelling that's increased the most in recent years is single occupancy. If you're interested in reaching young adults, say 25 to 35, just over half of them are single. A young man grew up in his home church, went to college, got a job, moved to another town in the state with his job, started going to the church of his same denomination. He went there every Sunday, 3 or 4 months. And then one Sunday, after going there all this time, one Sunday people asked him his name. And they invited him to the coffee time. They asked him where he was from, where he worked, where he lived, where he went to school. And as he's walking home, he's thinking, out of all these weeks I've been here, why was it so different today? And then he realized what had happened. His fiancée was with him that day. You see, you spot that couple, oh, we have a playbook for that. You give us a 20-something all by themselves, we don't know what to do with that. You know? But you give us that couple, oh, we know how to do that. You see? But have people in your church ever said, we need a few more young families with children? I'm sure we do. But that's the group that we reach about as well now as we ever have. You got a married couple with children living at home. We do pretty well. But that group in the 1950s, that represented 50% of all the households in the United States. Today, it's closer to 20%, 22%. Marriage became a minority, just under 50% for the first time in census-taking history just a few years ago. So we may need to question some of our assumptions. Peter Drucker says that when organizations have done well for a long time and then they're not doing well, it's not what they're doing is bad, but their assumptions may be wrong. Not what they're doing is wrong, but their assumptions may be wrong. So it may be the picture of what we have in mind of who that new person might be may be very different from who is actually there in the population. And then finally, your current members. We've already talked about the people worshiping less frequently. So we're going to have to think about more and more ways to build relationships, have communication and all. But how do you build engagement? The Gallup organization says they have 3 groups of people in churches. One called the engaged, and those are people who are at church, and they want to be. I mean, they could be somewhere else, but they prefer to be at church. And then you've got the unengaged. These are people that may or may not be there. They may or may not know what's going on. They may or may not give. And then you've got the actively unengaged. These are the people that even if they're there, you wish they weren't there, you know. They're the cave dwellers, consistently against virtually everything. And what they found is the way that you improve the actively engaged people is not so much from the actively unengaged, but by those who are engaged nominally, for them to become actively engaged. So how are we doing? So yes, we keep up with attendance, but what else are we keeping up with? Are we just doing something that's very thin? Are we doing something that's deep? It's what Hallmark Cards. I lived in Kansas City for 18 years, and Hallmark Cards is located there. It's a wonderful organization, and but somebody there came up with the concept of share of the mind as opposed to market share. So, I mean, Hallmark would know at any moment, they have this much of the market, American Greetings has this much of the market, and then a few others have the rest of that. And so, one, you can try to expand your share of the market, but what they decided to do was not to try to get a lot of people who weren't buying cards to buy cards, but to get the people who had already lifted their hands to buy Hallmark cards to buy more and to buy other things. And out of that came this Hallmark Crown Club or something like that. My wife is the premier member of that. She thinks they set that whole thing up for her. You know, when you buy something, you give them your card, and they send you every time I'm talking to her, oh, I had to stop by Hallmark because I've got a coupon that runs out tomorrow. And so what they've done is, it's instead of going out to new people, you're taking the people already there and you're trying to go share of the mind. I'd call share of the heart. So you could say, well, of our community, this many are in our church. But the other way is, what's your share of the heart? What's your share of the heart? Gosh, that's plenty from me. Give me some questions or some feedback if you would. Yes.
You talk about focus. How, as we're starting to make changes, how do we keep the focus?
Question is, how do you keep the focus? What you're trying to do is, I mean, churches have good mission statements, but sometimes they're so generic you could take them to another church and they would work. But say, take your mission and what's going on now. Given our mission and what's going on now, what's God calling us to in the near future? So it may be because of an opportunity or because of a challenge. And it doesn't mean you're not doing other things, but you're meaning you're really trying to focus on that. Or maybe this is a window of opportunity that we have because of new populations coming in or changing makeup of schools or something like that. So what does that mean? And it's not so much adding another program. For instance, let's say a church realizes we started as a community church, but now we're disconnected from the community. You could have a separate group, say, go try to figure out some way to connect to the community, but think about this. What if you ask everybody in the church to look at their ministry planning for the next year through the lens of reconnecting with our community? So you get trustees looking at it. Well, what would it be? How could our facilities be more available to the community? You get music looking at it. Should we open up something to the community? Should we start a community children's choir or something? A missions area looks at it through that. You see? Or here's a church that realized that even though the population had not gotten older, for 25 consecutive years, the average age of their congregation had gone up. Their vision evolved around reaching younger people because they were there, that fit their mission, and that was a gap. But they asked every group to do their planning for the next year looking through the lens of reaching younger people. And they asked everybody to try to do your ministry in the next year in such a way that you reach a somewhat younger, not young people, a somewhat younger constituency. And so you had all kinds of things. You did have music, starting a children's choir. The missions area had a strong volunteers in mission program. They added a youth component to that. There were many other examples. So, but you keep, and in this case, pastors need to be the chief communication officer. You need to be the chief storyteller, reminding folks God has been at work here in most of our churches before any of us were here. And we're part of a moving stream. And God has put a call on us for this time, and we want to be faithful to that. Another question? Yes?
What are the advantages and disadvantages of our tradition? We talk a lot about going back to Wesley, and a lot of people aren't interested in that. Think of the spirit of Wesley, but not exactly.
That's right. Absolutely. I did a book called Leadership in the Wesleyan Spirit, and I said at the beginning, this is not a back to Wesley movement. It's not to go back to the forms, because the forms is what Wesley said would remain when the spirit of true godliness had left. What we want to do is to say, what was the motivation behind Wesley? He began with people. He followed the people. He cared for people, especially poor people. I mean, there are a lot of things. Now, what does that look like today? And some of these things, we honor the tradition, but we can't expect other people who don't share that tradition to honor it unless we give them a reason to. So, I was talking with someone earlier about the concept of connection and connectional. If you just put that out there as a phrase for people to give deference to, there are a lot of people today they won't. But if you give an example of lives that are transformed because of this connectional spirit, and then you say, now some of you know that's what we've traditionally called as connectional, then they'll nod, and others will say, well, that makes sense. I never knew what that meant, you see? So keep the focus. And this, used to, if you were talking to somebody new about your church, you might say, we're the United Methodist Church over here. We have services at this time. And, if you're not careful these days, that can sound like we want you to do something for us. We've got to start our conversations. Tell me about your story. Tell me what led you here. And then, would you like to hear about what our church is about? And there you say, we're about helping all people, whether they're in our church or not. No church is right for everybody, but we have a vision, and here's what it is. And then give them an opportunity to join in that vision.